Many people were influenced by the great author Malcolm Gladwell books, including myself, The Tipping Point, Blink, David and Goliath, What the Dog Saw, and many others. But recently, I found out that the guy who influenced the most on the work and thinking of Gladwell is my guest today, ریچارد ניسبت. In fact, in the cover of his last book, Thinking, a Memorial, we have the Malcolm Gladwell quote, "The most influential thinker in my life has been the psychologist Ríčard Ніسбет. He basically gave me my view of the world." Want to know why? Wait for the conversation. Hi, and welcome to my channel, The World of Rועי, where I host and speak with the most interesting and influential people and scholars from all around the world to discuss science, psychology, philosophy, religion, theology, artificial intelligence, and even more. And if this is your first time in the channel, please consider subscribing, hit the bell button, and give me thumbs up. And my guest today is Professor Ríčard Nísbet. Professor Ríčard Nísbet is one of, wow, I don't know how to say, is one of the most important and most cited scholars in the field of psychology. He wrote many books, including The Person and the Situation, the Geography of Thought, how Western and Eastern think differently, and Intelligence and How to Get It, Mindware, and most recently, Thinking, a Memoir. So Ríčard, thank you so much for coming. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Thanks for having me.
I couldn't be more excited. And let me tell you this, I first came across your name. I have a PhD in computer science, so I didn't grow up in the field of psychology, but I first came across your name along with Lee Ross in the great online course, The Science of Everyday Thinking, and just I got hooked. So I bought your books and I just read your material, and it just blew my mind. I think, you know, the distinction between personality and situation, the mere fact that we're philosophers, you know, from all around, from all over history said human beings are, they usually meant Westerns are, and so much more. So first, again, it's a great honor. And let me start with something that strikes me as a young researcher. In the beginning of your last book, you write, and I quote, "Those research teams has made it possible to work on extremely wide range of topics, some rather distant from the topics of thinking, including the proper way to understand the contribution of personality to social behavior, the application of microeconomics principles to decisions we make in everyday life, why the typical job interview is worse than worthless, and so on and so forth." Now, as the young researchers, we more often than not get the advice, stay focused. Yes, just stay focused on one thing and be the best you can at one thing. And my question is, because you span across many different areas and papers, is this just a before tenure, after tenure policy, or even before tenure as a young researchers, it's a good advice, you know, to not just do one thing, but, you know, go do this one and go do that one?
Well, certainly I took the route of doing two major lines of research my first few years out from the PhD. And it's a good thing, because the thing I put most of my effort in was a description of the eating behavior of overweight people and why they got fat. That my advisor ended up getting all the credit that there was to be gotten from that. I mean, he set me on the topic, and that was great. And then, you know, he talked about it a lot, and so he got the credit. The other stuff I did was really with my left hand, the attribution stuff. I thought of myself as a physiological psychologist when I started at Yale, and which is anybody who knows me now thinks that's kind of comical, because I don't have any of the requisite skills.
Yeah.
So it's, but I did manage to find something that I could do much better. So I would say, you know, do what interests you. I mean, and if it's good, you'll be rewarded for it. And if it's not good, no matter how much you focus, you're not going to get much reward.
Because my main discipline is computer science and artificial intelligence, but some years ago I was hooked by the notion of intelligence, and I wrote a very lengthy book called Intelligence, the Unpleasant Truth in Hebrew. And it was completely off my academic, you know, position at being a computer scientist. But I said, wow, it's so interesting, and life is too short. So I don't know how they're going to get it or how they're going to appreciate it. I really don't care, you know, because I think that I have something to say, and I think that it is very, very important. Now, after reading your book, it is hard not to compare your cooperation with the late Lee Ross and the Tversky Kahneman cooperation that got them the Nobel. And by the way, Kahneman is mentioned, the name Kahneman is mentioned more times in your book than the name Lee Ross, which was a surprise to me. Kahneman,
that's a surprise to me.
Yes, Kahneman is mentioned 25 times. Yeah, I know that Tversky, he got a whole chapter. Yeah, but Kahneman is mentioned 23 times, and Lee Ross is just 18. I said, wow, this is very strange. So we will start with this. It seemed that Lee Ross and Amos had a lot of common. Do you find yourself similar to Danny in any way? Like it's the Lee ریצארד, Amos Danny duo?
Well, there are certainly some similarities. I mean, Amos and Lee were relatively easygoing people. Both Danny and I can be a little bit incandescent from time to time. So there's that. Temperamentally, probably I'm closer to Kahneman, and Lee is closer to Tversky. Intellectually, I don't know, it's quite a different situation. I mean, Danny and Amos had very different talents. And Lee and I were completely complementary. I mean, we thought the same way about everything. So to the extent that I used to say, save time. I don't have to learn all that much about all kinds of political things, because Lee's going to think about it, and he's going to have the opinion that I would have if I had been keeping up with it. So I'm going to save my time and just let Lee tell me what political views to have.
Because it's nice. I read in your book that Amos almost never was never wrong, but Danny was sometimes wrong. Wow, it's not something that you write in autobiography unless you want to just put everything on the table. So it was a very personal moment, I think, you know, the Amos Lee. But, you know, let's go back to the beginning. Amos and Danny joked that your book with Lee Ross, Human Inference, made them famous. Now, what you say about this, because that's funny but it's much more nearly the other way around. So can you draw a line between that distinguish your work, you and Lee Ross, than Amos and Danny? We know that, you know, behavioral economics, people are irrational, but you did basically the same thing, or you did something completely different or slightly different?
Well, it was what I was doing was remarkably similar. I mean, I think in the same year, their most famous paper came out in Science, talking about heuristics, introducing the notion of heuristics and biases, and opposing them to statistical ways of thinking. Well, I was doing the same thing. I mean, really, quite independently, but their orientation was broader and deeper than mine, I think. And so I just sort of hitched my wagon to their stars. I mean, I just said, well, this is what my enterprise is about too. So I'm going to derive my work from Kahneman and Tversky, even though it wasn't initially derived from them at all. It was independently determined. I say independently, but not really, because Amos was a graduate student at Michigan in the mathematical psychology program there. And what got me into doing work comparing people's reasoning to statistical requirements and probability requirements was a talk given by somebody in that program, which I heard when I was still at Yale, where he showed that people are conservative Bayesians.
Yes, I know.
So, right. So you find out a piece of evidence and it suggests X with a certain probability, and you find out another independently known fact, statistically independently known fact, which suggests X with a certain. And as you keep getting these pieces of evidence, it really becomes, from a statistical standpoint, overwhelming that X is the case, but you don't quite keep up with that. I mean, so we're conservative Bayesians. And the joke goes, it's not a joke really, it's an amusing fact.
That Amos told it to Danny.
Right, Amos told it to Danny, and Danny said, baloney, people aren't any kind of statistician. And by the way, that's one of the main things that he was wrong about and remains wrong about. People are quite good intuitive statisticians in domains with which they're familiar because you're forced into it. I mean, you can find people who follow sports will be, they'll pay attention to base rates, they understand the concept of regression and so on. People who don't follow sports don't see that. They don't understand sports events that way. But if you've done drama in your life, you've done acting, you understand regression and base rate and law of the large numbers in the context of theater. And more generally than that, we have a quite good understanding of the law of large numbers. I mean, it's really just right in the sense that we realize not only that more evidence is better than less evidence, but we know that this is especially true if the thing we're thinking about is highly inherently variable. So if
can you give me an example? Because okay. I think that people have very hard time grasping the law of large numbers and overlapping distributions in the context of intelligence, because in the last 4 years, lecture about intelligence, overlapping distribution, the law of large numbers. It's very hard to people to extract themselves from the now and their first experiences and say, listen, different people see the world differently. It's very hard for them to get this idea in the context of intelligence. So could you give me like an example?
Okay, so we did a study. I did this with David Krantz and with Ziva Kundu, by the way, who was an Israeli social psychologist who really was fully Danny's equal in brilliance. Unfortunately, she died early in her career. But we told people that there's an island where there are a tribe of people, whatever, I don't know what name we gave it. And we're going to tell you some things about this and ask you some questions. So we said, you've encountered, there's a new element on this island, and it burns with a blue flame. A sample of it. You've seen a sample of it. It burns with a blue flame. What percentage of samples do you think would glow with a blue frame? And people say, well, 100%. I mean, the one case is sufficient, as Hume would have said, for a full induction. When we say there's a type of bird on the island, and you've just seen one, and it's blue. What color do you think all shrebles would be? We say, well, probably blue, but not necessarily. I'd want to know more, and so on. Or if you say you've encountered 2 or 3 of these tribe members, and each of them is obese. Do you think they're all obese? No, no, no. I want to see more. So they condition their use of the law of large numbers on the variability they expect for the kind of dimension they're estimating. Well, that is exactly the right way to think about the law of large numbers. The problem is we don't spontaneously, as you're indicating, we don't spontaneously think about the law of large numbers in domains where we're not all that familiar with the evidence and how to think about it.
Now, let me ask you something, because I think it strikes me again. In one of Danny's book, he said, he told a story that early in his career, he was introduced to some physicist, and he told him about his research. And the physicist just left the conversation and said, I'm not interested in the psychology of stupidity. This is what the physicist said to Danny. I'm not interested in the psychology of stupidity. And ever since Danny Kahneman and, the Dan Ariely books, we know that people are irrational, and we have like tons of zillions of many great, cool examples that people are irrationals. But maybe it is the other way around. Maybe Adam Smith was right, and people do rational decisions, but what Amos and Danny and you and Lee Ross and Dan really found are the exceptions. Like you said, people are very good with the law of large number in the context that they are familiar with, and people are much more rational than irrational. And your entire work, the entire Nobel Prize was just about the small exceptions. Would you agree?
Well, I don't know. I'd be hard to attach a percentage because the domain of all inferences is so enormous and varied. But I've actually come to view all of that work I did during the Tversky and Kahneman part of my life in the following way. They always said, by the way, the heuristics that they looked at, the representativeness heuristic, the availability heuristic, and so on, were perfectly good inferential tools for all kinds of things in the world. And then they're going to show you the exceptions. The way I would put that is that where we end up looking stupid is because information is coming to us in a form that we never came to us in evolutionary history. I mean, we're getting, numbers and probabilities are being given to us. We take samples of things. I mean, so the problem is the successor to the industrial age is the information age, and the information comes to us in a very odd form from an evolutionary standpoint. And that's where we stub our toe. I mean, that if we don't really know fully how to deal with information. And by the way, higher education, it turns out, gives a huge improvement in people's ability to not be stupid, which surprised me. I had no idea that would be the case, but it is the case. It's remarkable improvement, and in the laboratory, you can teach people statistical principles in such a way that they can apply it immediately to a huge range of events. But we could do a much better job. I mean, you teach the law of large numbers, and then you never, in a statistics class, and then you never say, oh, by the way, this has enormous relevance to your life in almost every way. And so does base rate, and so does regression, and so on. Give them a few everyday life examples. I think it would be hugely powerful and would make the human race much smarter, the minute you start doing that.
By the way, Judea Pearl is going to be here next month, and they, like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, wrote an article, why I'm just half Bayesian. And I think he basically says the same thing that you are saying, that, we tend to be Bayesian. We think that we are Bayesian, and more evidence will give us much better ideas or hypotheses, but it is very hard because we think in why, and Bayes' law doesn't think in why. So it's going to be a very nice thing to endeavor. Like now, I want to give two quotes from your book, one related to Lee and one related to Amos, and then we can move on. Now, Lee admitted to me that what you said, that his ambition in life had been to have an intellectual impact on the world without actually having to work much. In this, he succeeded, but it might not have happened without the taskmaster like me to take him work on books and his extremely talented collaborated Max Luper to keep his research program running. And this is like the Lee Ross quote, and I'm going to move to a different quote, but I think it's very similar. I waste a lot of time, Amos once told me. He didn't seem to regret it. In fact, he thought it was good policy. Michael Lewis quotes Amos as saying, the secret to doing good research is always to be a little unemployed. Now, ever since I read these two quotes, I keep thinking and pondering about. A, do you think that these two quotes come from the same source? Lee Ross didn't want to work too hard because he wanted good ideas, or he was just plain lazy? And
he was just plain lazy.
Okay.
And I don't know about Amos. I don't know if I would say that Amos was lazy. I mean, but Lee was. I mean, Lee was astonishingly lazy.
Okay.
I used to joke that I beat 2 books out of Lee Ross.
and the other thing, because you wrote in your book that Amos told you, first say no, but if you can't say no, so do what you need to do. But if you can please elaborate, because I think that, many creative thinking and and the process of being creative and being productive with ideas is something that I always thinking about. And what Amos told you, and what I think, could you please elaborate of, it is really a secret to doing a good research is always to be a little unemployed? Would you say it's a good advice?
Yeah. Yes, I would, definitely. I would never quite put it that way for myself. I mean, if you're ethnically Methodist, as I am, you really sort of always have to be working. I mean, that's what, Methodists are thrifty and they work hard. But the great thing about being a social psychologist is that it's never clear when you're not working. So I do lots of things that are fun. I say, well, I can always justify it on a work standpoint, although that isn't really why I did it. But so it amounts to the same thing: laziness, Methodism. And I don't know where Amos got the idea of being underemployed. You would never think of Amos as lazy. I mean,
but it's very hard to be unemployed as a young faculty member, because the stress these days, I think it's much different than 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Would you agree that, young faculty members that you see right now have much more pressure on them, to publish it? It was always publish or perish, but now I think, it's much, much harder. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
So how can you be in these times a little unemployed?
Yeah, I think, well, if you're a social psychologist, you have my gimmick of saying that you're always working no matter what. But it's, when I was my first few years in the business, I used to walk around the department with a coffee cup looking for somebody to talk to just for fun. If you did that today, you'd get fired. I mean, so I'm with a coffee cup wandering aimlessly in the hall. And then I point out in the book that was sort of overnight, the situation changed. I mean, it didn't feel gradual. It felt like, and Bob Zions, great social psychologist. And by the way, I'll tell you something interesting about Bob Zions, who was considered one of the greatest social psychologists ever. He's Polish, raised Catholic, his wife, he's now dead. His wife just found out that he was Jewish. And he didn't know it. Probably his parents had raised him Catholic for protection.
After the Holocaust method, like.
Right. Well, this was before, he was born before the Holocaust. So it's as if they had an intuition, you know. That.
Okay.
So at any rate.
How did she tell him?
Her.
Mazel tov, you're Jewish.
Right, exactly. Well, he never found out. I mean, so presumably, because his wife didn't know, his children didn't know, and almost surely he didn't know. In fact, he used to jokingly say to his Jewish friends, "Just think how smart I could be if I were Jewish." But at any rate, this is a long way around. Bob Zions and I were talking about. I mean, this is crazy. I was a full professor. I'm behaving like an assistant professor. When I was an assistant professor, I behaved like a full professor. And he said, it's the women who came into the business almost overnight. And they didn't know how hard you're supposed to have, how hard are you supposed to work? I mean, I'm just going to knock myself out and do, you know. But if everybody else is taking the stairs 2 at a time, you know, you start doing it yourself. Now, I don't know whether this is true or not. I don't know whether it's fair to blame it on the women or not, but it's certainly, it did coincide with the era in which women were coming into psychology.
I read this anecdote in your book. I went back, you know, to go to some reference because, you know, it's a big thing, what he just said, found none. And then I said, okay, I'm not going to mention this because it's too much for me, but I think it's a very interesting idea. It's a very interesting idea that, you know, that the women suddenly showed up and changed, you know, the balance. Right. The balance. And, you know, and I think that this is how it goes with social psychology, that you don't know exactly which A caused which B. So, and from that, we are going from thinking, we are going to intelligence and how to get it. Great book. And I must tell you a story. Some years ago, I started writing a book about artificial intelligence. And since artificial intelligence aimed to duplicate human intelligence, I thought, you know, maybe I just write a chapter about human intelligence. And I knew nothing about human intelligence, just nothing. I knew, you know, that the Gardner theory and that there is an IQ thing and no one knows what is IQ, at least not in Israel. We know what our SAT is, but not the IQ. Most people in Israel don't know what the IQ is. And then I started reading. And I started reading Richard Heyer and Erla Hunt and Charles Murray and McIntosh and Jensen and Gardner. And as more as I read, I became more convinced that it was just the other way around. And then I came across your book and James Flynn's book. So I read those two, you know, to get a counter perspective. And I have some questions that I want to ask you about intelligence, but I want to start with something from your last book. You said, and I quote again, Amos was not just intensely smart about ideas, he was common sense smart, street smart. And you said common sense. Now, in your interview with Michael Shermer, you said that Hillary campaign lacked a common sense because she offended many people. And I would like to ask you, like,
wait, who lacked common sense?
Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, well, it wasn't that she lacked common sense. It's just that there was
in the campaign. The campaign lacked common sense.
Well, certainly, the campaigns.
Yeah. The campaign lacked common sense, but she was responsible for the campaign. So. But let me ask you this. What's the relation between the two, okay? What's the relation between the things that made Amos smart, you know, the IQ test, the shortest IQ test is to figure out how smarter Amos Tversky is more than you, okay? This kind of brilliant that we associate usually with IQ or with like the conventional way of intelligence, and the common sense smart, the street smart, okay? What's the relation between the two? Because there is a great quote for Thomas Sowell that some ideas are so stupid that only academics can believe in them.
Yeah, well, actually, Thaler, Richard Thaler, who is a crony of Kahneman and Tversky, and who, by the way, got an education as a social psychologist, and that's where many of his ideas came from. And Amos and Danny, I mean, as well, we think of them as cognitive psychologists, and Thaler as an economist, but really, I mean, Lee used to say about behavioral economics that it was social psychology with a name change for business reasons.
Definitely. Yeah. And just a second, moreover, Danny told me, and I think he told it in an interview, that they specifically chose an economic journal to publish their first paper because they knew that no psychology journal will ever publish their paper.
Which paper is that?
I think it's about prospect theory, but I'm not sure. You know,
yeah.
they said, okay, we will get, because I'm not going to shake the world of psychology. So let's say, listen, this is a great implication in economics. Okay, so yeah. What's the relation between common sense smart and intelligence?
Well, first of all, let me show how different they can be. I mean, Hillary Clinton is a great example of how they can be different. But, you know, when you teach at a good institution like Michigan, you're constantly encountering people with, you know, very high IQs and I mean, brilliant in a seminar setting, but who can't do the business. I mean, it's just they can't be a scientist because you say, here, go out and test this idea, and they come back with nothing. I mean, it's just you learn quickly if you're certainly a psychologist. I don't know if it's that way in the other sciences as well, that there can be such a gap between, you know, obvious intelligence of an IQ sort and ability to get things done. And I'm actually thinking about writing another book about intelligence now, which part of the goal will be to shrink IQ to its proper place in our understanding of intelligence, because it's so far from the whole deal. The great physiologist, I'm blanking on his name, from the 1920s,
Luria
said, what?
Luria, maybe?
No, he's a biologist, a physiologist. I'll think of it probably before we're done today, but he said, you know, the ability to do science is a multiplicative affair. It's sort of raw brilliance times willingness to work hard. Lee Ross, to the contrary, notwithstanding.
There are exceptions.
Right. And ability to get along with people, curiosity. I mean, and I think this is true, your effectiveness in life is a multiplicative function. And he said, if any of those things is close to zero, the whole thing comes to zero. And for example, I have a friend who's now deceased who had the highest tested IQ I ever heard of, 184. I didn't know the numbers went that high. And if you knew him, you say, okay, yeah, I can see that. I mean, it was an amazing mind, but he got his PhD in political science in the 1950s, at a time when the greatest university in the world was considered by many people to be the University of Chicago. So with all those brains and with all that education and the prestige behind it, he only managed to have 3 jobs at institutions that no academic in the US ever even heard of. I mean, and he had very little ability to get along with people. He wasn't a bad man. He was a good man, but he was just sort of impossible. There's a British term for this. He was not clubbable.
Yeah, so again, I learned a new word. Again, could you please repeat this word?
Clubbable.
Clubbable.
Right. I mean, you couldn't invite him into your club. He wouldn't be amusing.
Clubbable. Very nice. Very nice. He wasn't clubbable. Okay. So can we start with the hard questions? And again, with all due respect, and you obviously seen that I truly respect your work, okay? But can we start with the hard questions?
Sure.
Okay. Would you now, first, after reading, and I specifically exclude Charles Murray, okay? But Richard Heyer, Russell Warren, Errol Hunt, McIntosh, and even Jensen and other guys as well, okay? Would you consider your opinions and your views to be the non-orthodoxy view of intelligence right now? Because if I read The Neuroscience of Intelligence by Richard Heyer, published in 2017, and if I read Errol Hunt, Human Intelligence, I will read something very different from your book, okay? So would you agree that what you say is the unorthodoxy of intelligence?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So we start with this, okay? And another thing, would you agree that intelligence is a unitary phenomenon? In other words, it encapsulates just one thing. It's not like in the big 5 that you have 5 different orthogonal view of personality. If you're smart in one thing, let's say abstract reasoning, you will be better in other things like calculation, memory, general knowledge, etc. Would you say that intelligence is a unitary thing?
No, not at all. I mean, IQ tests are very different from all kinds of tasks that require intelligence in life. First of all, they're ripped out of context. The whole point in IQ tests were founded on a wrong idea of intelligence, that you could that intelligence could be stripped from context. And IQ tests were going to be just a thermometer. You dip into people's brains. And they very deliberately did not include, from the outset, they did not include questions for which the answer came from formal education, because of the conviction that intelligence is independent of education, which is absolutely, the longer I live, the more idiotic that seems to me. It's intelligence is in our daily lives is totally embedded in context, and the amount of intelligence that we have is very much dependent on early life experiences, which, by the way, I mean, the people you're talking about will tell you probably still today. I haven't kept up with the literature. I don't need to. I just make sure that nobody has ever contradicted the material in that intelligence book, except you'll find that Murray does. I mean, Murray contradicts it on the grounds of race still. He seems ineducable on that point. But it turns out we have now very good evidence. You place an adopted kid in an upper middle class home, or you randomly, as it were, put him in a lower class home, that's worth 12 to 18 points on IQ. Okay, so even IQ, is massively dependent on early life, totally in conflict with 70 years of.
But just a second, I think that even Eric Turkheimer, I think the most, the most important findings of Eric Turkheimer, who is like lean to the environmentalist school of intelligence, said, listen, when you go to the lower class, environment plays a big role. And when you go to the middle and upper class, environment, or even shared environment, as we say, play a small role. But I would, with your permission, I would like to go back a little bit and say, could you give me an example of a cognitive task, or cognitive test, or cognitive task that doesn't correlate with what we know as intelligence? Okay. In other words, would you consider Gardner model of multiple intelligence, the 8 independent intelligence, to be correct? Because even Gardner himself in 2016 said, listen, we need to think of a different model.
Well, I do certainly think that, I mean, it's an empirical fact. I mean, you measure IQ, you got a number there, and you give someone a task, any kind of task, which requires something that you would say is intelligence. IQ will correlate with that.
So this is a unitary thing. This is a unitary thing. If you're good in this, you will be good in this. If you're above average, you will be above average, not?
No. And actually, here's a fascinating fact, which didn't find its way into my intelligence book. The higher your IQ, the more jagged your ability profile. I'm a good example of that. I mean, I can't open a can. I mean, you know, I'm mechanically pathetic. I'm terrible at language. And one of the punishments of my life is to live with a woman wonderful in every respect, except one, which is that she sets the other end of the continuum from me on linguistic ability. I mean, for me to learn a language is to brute force memorization, hard Methodist kind of work.
Have you ever learned another language?
What's that?
Have you ever learned another language?
Well, let's put it this way. I got to the point where I could read simple novels in German and in French.
Oh.
I couldn't do either of those today. I mean, but it was a huge amount of effort to do that. My wife took 20 hours of Chinese. We went to China and she was talking to people in Chinese. That's the difference. So, I mean, again, jagged ability. And there are things in which my wife is, you know, intelligent, but not brilliant for sure. And here she absolutely sets a scale on linguistics.
Okay, so 2 more questions, because it's so interesting speaking with you, and we have a lot to cover, but, you know, intelligence is just one thing. What if in 3 or 5 years from now, I can just, you know, by measuring the width of your outer cortex to give you a good measure of your IQ, would you say, hey, this is not an artificial phenomena, it is something that is structured within the physiology of the brain? Let's say that I can do an fMRI scan, and with that fMRI scan, deduce with good certainty what your intelligence is. Would this change what you think about intelligence?
No, I mean, it's swimming upstream of 1,000 facts that we know about, like the one I just gave you. I mean, the thickness of the cortex, it's as thick as it is. And you have a very successful psychologist, if I do say so myself, who is mechanically, pathetically bad, and linguistically, you know, not retarded, but certainly not exceptional at all, to say the least, and many other kinds of things. I mean, I'm constantly being impressed with the number of occupations which I could not possibly handle. I mean, it's just completely outside my skill limit. And it's, so, you know, one number of the thickness of your cortex is not going to capture that kind of diversity. And
let's say that I can screen your DNA, and from your DNA, from DNA of an embryo, and this is what some of the research that is doing, that is currently done right now in China, that they want to take, you know, the very smart people and say, okay, DNA is a multivariable thing. or intelligence is a multivariable thing, can we say, okay, from this stream of DNA, I can guess with certainty what your intelligence is. So with this achievement change something about your views? Or
No. I mean, because intelligence, because this fact I keep trying to impress on you, that the ability profile gets more and more jagged as you get smarter and smarter. Let me give you an example here. I often ask audiences, who do you think has the higher IQ, Barack Obama or George W. Bush? I've never found a single person, conservative or liberal, who thinks that George Bush is smarter than Barack Obama. We have good reason to believe they have about the same IQ. What's going on with George Bush? His own aides describe him as completely incurious. The man was out of the US twice in his life. His father was ambassador to China, so he didn't presumably even make it to China very often. So incurious, intellectually lazy, and people are responding to it. Well, but in terms of IQ, he's perfectly high IQ. It's just an intellect that's quite inferior to a Barack Obama. I mean, Barack Obama is amazing to me. The range of things that he could do extraordinarily well. I mean, so he's our example of a highly intelligent person, but he doesn't have a higher IQ than George Bush, in all probability. And by the way, SAT score is quite a good measure of IQ. It's not the same. And here's another kind of fact that fits my view of intelligence.
It's what the A stands for. It usually stands for aptitude, but now it says it stands for assessment from the SAT. The standard, what the A stands for.
Yeah, who knows? And then now it's just SAT. Don't ask me what the A means.
Yeah, but it used to be aptitude, but after we write, they change it to assessment. I'm not going to measure the aptitude. I'm just going to measure, assessment something. Now, the last question that I have regarding intelligence is something that I wrote in my book regarding the sub-Saharan African have an average IQ of 70, as Richard Lynn and other measured it, okay? And you said, and I quote, it just can't be done. Because IQ of 70 basically means the border of retardment in the US. Yeah? IQ of 70 will get you out of the electrical chair in the US. And you said, this is just can't be done. Just can't be. If they had an average IQ of 70, which means that half of the population is lower than 70, they wouldn't know when to plow, how to do anything that relates to, stay alive. And this is your quote, okay? And the questions that I would like to raise, and I will do it with all very cautiously, okay? Basically, what you said, that if their IQ cannot be 70, let's say that it is higher. We know it's not 100, because 100 it's not 100, but let's say that it's like 80 or 85. And if sub-Saharan Africans has an average IQ of 80 to 85, and this is the measured average IQ for the Black population in the US, it basically destroys your argument because you go for the environment thing, but you can think of two more different environments in sub-Saharan Africa and Manhattan. So if both populations in two very different environments will have an average of 80, 85, basically environment has nothing to do with this, no? This is like the hardest question that I have.
I can't tell you how wrong that is. And let me tell you the fact which will change your mind. I think I know where your mind is, and this will now throw a sand in the gears of a belief. In 1970, a British psychologist named Eysenck wrote a book which was all about how science has proved that blacks are less intelligent than white for largely genetic reasons. And he said, and oh, by the way, you'll be interested to know this, my fellow Englishman, the Irish IQ is 15 points lower than the English IQ. And that too is genetic.
I'm an Israeli. I'm an Israeli.
Yes.
No, my fellow Englishman, because I'm an Israeli, so the Jewish IQ is better. But okay.
Yeah, it is for sure.
Okay.
But the Irish IQ is 15 points below the English. Same thing, same as in America. Black IQ at that time was 15 points lower than white IQ. And at the time Eysenck wrote this book, Irish IQ was 15 points lower than English IQ. And the reason for that, he says, is that the smart ones left in the 19th century to go because they didn't want to starve, leaving only the stupid people in Ireland. Well, that story worked at that point. It's actually ludicrous, but he could get away with that in a scientific enterprise. Today, the cognitive skills of the Irish exceed the cognitive skills of the English, and the per capita GDP of Ireland is higher than that of England. Okay, so
this is very interesting. I've never heard those numbers, and again, I've read a lot about IQ, so I'm not familiar with what you just said. It's extremely interesting, but you are not saying it's about the Black community in the US. Would you say that the average IQ figure for Blacks in the US right now in 2022 is 100 or lower?
Oh, it's lower. I mean, it's the last time we had a good number for what it was 9.5 points. And
would you say that the average IQ for Asian is higher than white, and this in part explain the disproportional ratio for Asian in the Silicon Valley?
Say the last again.
That the average IQ for Asian is approximately 5 points higher than whites, and this in part explain the disproportional ratio of Asian in the Silicon Valley.
The evidence on IQ for Asians versus whites is
in the US.
It's simply not there. It's not there. I mean, but I'll tell you, and this is again, this will change your mind about intelligence. In the 1960s, there was an IQ test and SATs given to tens of thousands of high school seniors. Asian IQ was trivially lower than white IQ. SAT scores of Asians were a standard deviation higher, which is enormous.
Wow.
A major difference between IQ tests, which were designed to be independent of anything you learned. They're not successful or not remotely successful at that, but they were designed to do that. And SAT scores, which in the sense of almost the opposite, they were designed to show how much you know. I mean, what's your chemistry score, what's your, et cetera. So now you probably are familiar with the concept of tiger mother, that the Asian mother is going to, I mean, or the joke in the US,
we have the Jewish mother.
Yes, right. And there's a joke that if you ask Jewish mothers what they think about tiger mothers, they're amateurs.
By the way, I think this is basically what James Flynn said in one of his last interviews. He said, listen, what we know, I want to go all the way for culture, okay, all the way for environment. But we know that the environment, the culture of Jewish women, Jewish mothers in the US is extremely different, okay? Let's say that you go to the basketball team of your school or of your university. A Black mother will be extremely happy. A Jewish mother will be extremely disappointed, extremely sad. And James Flynn said, I don't know how to change it. I don't know how to change it, but this in part what distinguished the one standard deviation above average of Jewish Americans and Black Americans. The culture is different. I believe that the genetics is purely the same, but we have two extremely different cultures, and this is an inherent problem that is unsolvable right now. And again, James Flynn said, this is a major problem. Again, the genetics is just the same. What can we do about the aspirations, about the culture of learning versus another culture? Would you say that this is a hard question?
That sounds like Jim, all right. And I would agree with that. I mean, culture changes in geological time, practically. I mean, I don't know if you know that I've showed that the US South is still a culture of honor. They're still prepared to shoot anybody who gets.
We have it in Israel. We have it in Israel.
No, you don't have a culture. You have the exact opposite of a culture.
No. Not the Jewish community. The Arab Muslim community in Israel have exactly culture of honor. Exactly. And they will kill their daughter if she disobey the chastity rules. Exactly the culture of honor we have in Israel. Not for the Jewish community.
The whole Mediterranean basin is a culture of honor. Think of South Italians, Sardinians, Corsicans. I mean, they'll meet the Arabs one-on-one when it comes to culture of honor. Now, how it is that the Jews escaped that, I don't know, but the Jews could not be more different from the culture of honor. I mean, Jews are generally considered in the world today to be quite rude. And in the US, they were considered rude 40 years ago. No one would say that today, by the way.
Rude? You say rude like chutzpah?
No, rude, insulting, unpleasant. You're an idiot. I mean, that's an insult.
And we say that the American Jews are much more gentle than what we are in Israel.
Absolutely. Yes. It's a totally different culture. I mean, it's a totally different culture from what it was 40 years ago.
By the way, Richard, according to my perspective or to my culture, I'm very polite to you right now. So if you experience any rudeness, please forgive me in advance, because in my culture, I'm extremely polite. Okay.
Right. Listen, I hang out with enough Jews older than you that I even my 20-year-old self would not have found you rude in this interview. Animated, that's all. So so it's but again, I'm going to get back to the tens of thousands of kids. The IQ is essentially the same of these kids. The SAT scores are quite significantly higher. And there's a parallel finding to that. Somebody did a study of first grade through fifth grade kids in 3 cities, Taipei, Beijing, and Minneapolis. And the American kids at the beginning of first grade had slightly higher IQs than these Asian kids. Now, these were samples of convenience, so we don't know what to make of that. But I believe it's probably true because Western culture focuses a lot on trying to make kids smarter. I was once on an airplane with a guy who's got his 4-year-old kid there, and he's got a picture book with him. And he says, Jimmy, pajamas. Are pajamas long or short? And Jimmy says, short. I said, no, Jimmy, pajamas are long. This is not a bizarre thing for a Westerner to do that. It would be bizarre for an Easterner. That's not what they do. Their socialization is all about emotion and a proper behavior and obedience and so on.
Just a second, because I want to move from what you said to the geography of thought, which again, let's take the intelligence part away and just focus on what you said, the culture of honor. So first, you say the geography of thought, Westerns and Easterns are different, and you tell a wonderful story that one of your graduate students, he was a Chinese, and he said to you, listen, when you said people are or human beings are, we don't think like this. And this strike, like a new theory of how Westerns and Easterns are different. Now, first, let me start. What about the Mediterranean? How should I consider myself as an Israeli? I mean, the Mediterranean, am I Western or am I Eastern? Because the Arab community, for example, is much more collective than in individuals, hence Easterns, but it's not tolerant at all. Therefore, it is Western. So where do you put the Middle East? Where do you put the Arabs?
Oh, Arabs are a culture of honor. They're intellectually closer to the Chinese than to the English in terms of the intellectual orientation, the cognitive orientation. And when I wrote that book, I was able to show with my brilliance an amazing flotilla of brilliant Chinese, Korean, and Japanese students. They're what's behind that book. I mean, I didn't have an idea in my head. They said, I'll bet Japanese see more in an underwater.
The famous Chinese poet 200 years ago said exactly the same thing. Yes.
Yeah. So, right. So, I just thought of them as different orientations: analytic in the West, holistic in the East, logical in the West, dialectical in the East, and so on. These are profound differences. I've begun to realize these are forms of intelligence. I mean, everybody knows that having an analytic mind, being able to think logically, being able to categorize sensibly, these are all Western virtues, which East Asians have to a lesser extent. Not a huge difference. I mean, at any rate. But I've now come to think of them as intelligence, as forms of intelligence. And the holistic, I mean, look, Asians walk into a situation, East Asians, and they see more of what's going on. They know physically more of what you're wearing, what I'm wearing. They characterize relations. They know where the dominance relations are, and they just have a much better understanding of the situation. They live in context. They have to respond to context, so they're very skilled at dealing with it.
Let me just give my viewers an example that you give in the book. Let's say that I have a picture of a tiger in the woods, and I ask a Western, "What do you see?" And since we are programmed to objective, subjective kind of thinking, what's the object? What's the main idea in this picture? Many Western will say it's a tiger, and they will omit the surroundings. But if you show the very same picture to Easterns, they won't say just a tiger. They say tiger in the wood. They will also incorporate the other thing, the background, which is not less important. Would you agree?
Well,
to some extent.
Leave the importance out of it. I mean,
yes.
They're paying much more attention to the background, and their eye movements are, you track them. They're looking back and forth between the tiger and the context, which is very uncharacteristic of Western subjects. They don't tend to do that. So, I mean, literally, they are seeing a different world. And they're picking up much more information than we do. And by we, it's
Westerners.
Actually, I think Israelis, you ask me, so where are they intellectually?
Where am I, ریچارد? Where am I? Where am I?
Yeah, well, you're not going to be surprised at my response is both.
I'm also a religious Orthodox, so I have on my back, the heavy weight of tradition, which stems for East and West. And by the way, in West, we, the most Aristotle said, the eye is a window to the soul, and vision is like the best, the highest in the hierarchy of senses. But in Judaism, sometimes hearing is even better, because you hear what the prophet says, and when you hear something, you hear even what the prophet didn't say. You hear the subconscious. So like the logic of the Jews is not about seeing, is about hearing. And this is a whole new philosophy, but never mind. Now, that's
extremely interesting to me. I mean,
I can give you a lot of more about this, because I think I teach Maimonides, the guy for the perplexed. And there was a very big theory about hearing versus seeing, because when I see something, when I use my eyes and something obscure or abstract, so I can't see what is hidden under or behind the abstraction. But when I hear, it's something different. Now, I can know a cat, I can distinguish a cat from a dog just by seeing, but I cannot distinguish a cat from another cat just by hearing. So in some ways, hearing is much inferior to seeing, but in other ways, hearing is much, much more profound in the context. And this is why we need to listen to what God speaks to us. It's listen, it's not hear. But again, last year I had Joe Heinrich on the show, and I
actually saw that.
Yes.
I saw it.
The conversation?
Your interview, yes.
Wow, thank you. How was it?
Yeah, very good interview.
Thank
very
you.
Good.
And what I ask you, I'm going to ask. What I ask him, I'm going to ask you. Let's say that you need to give the government a policy paper. What you do? Okay, how can I make a society less tribal? How can I make a society, with less honor of code or culture of honor, okay? How can I make a society like the Eastern, like the Chinese, more susceptible or with like more less obedience to authority, which is in the West, the science is less obedience to authority. So what can I take from your book and summarize and squeeze into a policy paper? Can I do something like this?
Can you do what?
How can I summarize your book? I want to diminish the culture of honor in the South. I want to give Easterns more, less obedience. I want to give Westerns more ways to look at the context, okay? Can I use your book as a policy to do A, B, C, and D, and get Westerns to be more Easterns, get Easterns to be more Westerns, and get Arabs to just eliminate the culture of honor?
Yeah, well, I don't know, except to say that profound cultural differences occur. There's an 18th century guide to the wealthy young Englishman going abroad to say what these people are like. Said, well, the Englishman will be sure to be delighted with the people who live in the German principalities. They're very kind and gentle and sweet people. They're absolutely lovely. If one were to find anything wrong with them, you might say, well, they probably wouldn't make good soldiers. But even then, if they were commanded by Italian generals, they might be able to be good soldiers. Now, that absolutely inverts our concept of Italy and Germany. I mean, the Irish go from being much less intelligent than the English to being slightly more intelligent than the English by the measures we have of these things. Of course, the culture of honor, I mean, Southern Americans are not remotely as steeped in the culture of honor than traditional Arabs are. But, you know, that 100 years ago, 150 years ago, I'm sure they would have met the Arabs on their own ground and equally. So there's been huge change in the
Richard,
US.
what you just said is just wait. Of course, culture is changing everything, but I didn't ask for, you know, of course, if we wait long enough, things will be different. But I'm asking you a different questions. Is there anything that the government can do right now? I will give you an example. Many Chinese come to Israel and say, listen, we want to learn from the startup nation. We want to be part of the startup nation. You Israeli have like zillion startups. Each Israeli has 2 startups, yes? And we want to take part of these startup nations. And they speak, you know, with entrepreneurs in Israel, and they speak about, you know, Israeli has Jewish, has a chutzpah, yes? And Israeli has like an extreme level of chutzpah. And part of the extreme level of chutzpah is that we don't treat authority with any respect. We don't read, okay? And then one of the Chinese asked one of the professors who told him that, in what lesson do you teach them this? Now, it's not part of the, we have one lesson that we teach you the chutzpah, it's a way of life. So the question the Eastern ask Israelis, how can we incorporate the chutzpah? But in some way you can't, because if you incorporate chutzpah, you won't be Chinese anymore. That's so right. Again, what can we do? You said, listen, Western need to learn more than Eastern because Eastern are more familiar with Western tradition and Western culture than Western with Eastern, yes? And this is what you wrote in the book, okay? But beside reading your great book, what else can be done?
Well, actually, you're touching on something that I'm doing right now. And it just ties in beautifully with your point about the Chinese coming to Israel to find out, you know, what's the secret ingredient? In US corporations now, there's something called the bamboo ceiling. You've heard of the glass ceiling, women that can't make it to the top. There's a bamboo ceiling, and the stereotype is Asians don't make it to the top of US corporations, even though they have the highest SAT scores. And it turns out, well, it's not Asians, it's East Asians that don't make it to the top of corporations. South Asians are more likely to be head of corporations than whites. And it has everything to do with chutzpah, everything to do with chutzpah. I mean, the Indian manner, the behavior, the deep personal character is assertive, not necessarily aggressive, although some people I know find
the distinction between assertive and aggressive is quite thin.
There is overlap. My experience with Indians always is, I had one student in my whole career, one undergraduate, come to me and basically quiz me about something to find out if he should believe it. And he was an Indian who's now got a startup. There are more Indians with billion-dollar startups in the US than there are any other foreign group. And there are not that many Indians in the US. I mean, it's still a tiny, tiny minority. And by the way, I think number 2 is Israeli. Now, of course, on a per capita basis, Israelis are way ahead of the Indians, but I mean,
thank you for mentioning it. Thank you.
So, but Indians, I mean, Indians are going to be a much bigger threat, and I don't mean in a violent sense, much more of a challenge than the Chinese because of this backwardness of the Chinese. And if you look at it by, I don't mean backwards in a civilization sense, I mean just not putting it out there and, and critiquing, standing up for their own view. But you see this in classrooms, in undergraduate classrooms. Professors find it very challenging to have a seminar with East Asian kids because they won't talk. And in business, when you get to business school or law school, a lot of your grade is dependent on how assertive you are. Stand up, and this is my opinion, and here's why I think that, and so on.
And there is this great Malcolm Gladwell story that I think from the tipping point that that airlines or aircraft in East Asia were just crashing because the co-pilot or the vice pilot, I don't know how to say it, when he detected something, it was rude. It was rude to say something to the primary pilot, and they need to retrain them in the context of pilot or avionics. Yes, if you see anything suspicious, please tell, no matter what happens. Now, again, I'm not calling you Professor Nis, I'm calling you ریچارد, and this is rude, but my perspective is that the best way to respect you is to actually read your work, okay? So in my way, do you respect Ríčard Nisbet? Yes, I read his work, I read his books, and I quoted his book. So in my opinion, yes, what we are doing right now is a most pure form of respect. And again, if the Chinese government would have hired you to give them advices regarding what you just said about critiques, what can you do for the Chinese government?
Well, the Chinese government, I thought you were going to say the following about the Chinese, and I don't know if it's still true, but for a while they were giving IQ tests to find the very smartest kids and give them the very best possible education. Idiotic to put your resources in that way. There's a study done in California by, what the hell was his name? Can't recall offhand. The study of genius. He tried to track down every kid with a high IQ in the California school system at that time in the 30s.
Like Louis Terman and his termites. And his termites, the termites.
Right. Those people, they were good, solid citizens. They were fine doctors and lawyers. They weren't geniuses. There were no Nobel Prize winners among them. Although there were kids from California in that era who did end up winning the Nobel Prize and being highly intellectually successful. And that tells you the limits of IQ test. I mean, in the received view of intelligence, this is impossible. I mean, he got all these high IQs kids, and they didn't do all that great, and there were lots of
and
people.
Even Louis Terman actually helped them in getting positions. So it even, I'm going to make your argument even better. Even though Louis Terman helped them, they didn't came out, extraordinary, because there is something about extraordinary which is not encapsulated solely by IQ. And this is why I think that you named the chapter of Amos as genius. Genius is not just a measure of how high your IQ is something, that just God pointed you and say, okay, you are something special. Right. And I totally agree with you on that.
I recommend to you the book I'm reading right now, called Leonardo. It's just unbelievable. The mind is unbelievable. I mean, every mind since then is inferior.
His biography?
Biography, yes.
Yeah, I read it. It's
the
not
one
a new book.
Came out.
No, because I read there is a biography by, just a second. Who is the author?
I don't know.
Okay. By
the
the
book
way,
is maroon, has a maroon cover.
by the way, I'm telling people that Leonardo, the mathematical level of Leonardo da Vinci was approximately fifth grade in today's standards. In today's standard, he couldn't solve Rubik's quadratic equation. I read it somewhere. So because, you know, what we know about math right now, what we know, the abstract that we know about math, you know, the idea that x plus 3 can be any x, and the concept of equations wasn't so clear during the times of Leonardo. He was genius. He was pure genius. Yes, no question about this. But it is that even with the low math level, he became to achieve great things. Now,
it's remarkable. There's the things he did that today you would use mathematics for, and he didn't know mathematics, and he was able to do it.
I think that some people, you know, God just touched them and say, listen, go take humanity to the next level. This is basically what happens. So, Richard, first, thank you so much for your time, for your conversation, for your wisdom, for all the great books and works that you have done during your lifelong career. And since I have a chutzpah, I had a great idea. I think it was a great idea regarding a psychology research, and I would like to share it with you. Would you like to hear?
Sure.
Okay. Now, I called it the other box, and I even started to write the paper. And being a magician, it was in the online course, The Science of Everyday Thinking. And I think that what you said about, you know, the pantyhose, that if you give person four different pantyhose, but all pantyhose are identical, he will choose the pantyhose closest to him. And this is done in many, many things. And then I read it and said, wow, in magic, because I used to be a magician, in magic, we had the very same thing. If you give people like 4 cards, he will never choose the closest to him. He will choose the second to closest to him. And then I start thinking, just a second, psychology or psychologists for the last 100 years just, investigated, the intuitive thinking, the intuitive, yes, let's say that I have 4 things, okay, I'm taking the one closest to me. But when you are in a magic situations, so you go out of your box and say, no, I'm not going for the obvious thing, and you will go to the other box. And magicians, for the last 100 years, have studied the other box. I will give you another example. If you ask a person to name a color, he will name red. But if you go to the magic literature, the magic literature say that if you ask a person for a color, he will say blue, because he think red, and then he said, no, it can't be red. I'm going out of the box. And my idea is that even the other box can be learned, can be determined. And this is what magicians have done throughout the last 100 years. What do you think?
No, well, that's fascinating. But it can't be as deterministic as our pantyhose experiment, because it's only 4 times more likely to go for the one on the end than the one on the start. That's a strong effect, but it's not enough to make you money.
Even more, because if a psychologist fails, so what happens? The standard deviation grows. But if a magician fails, it will just blow the whole show. So when a magician in his autobiography say, listen, people usually do A, B, and C, he puts a lot on this A, B, and C, because psychologists don't care. What do we care if the standard deviation like this or like this? But magicians do care.
Right. So I'm surprised that there's anything like this that would be 0-1. I mean, definitely.
No. But I would say that when you approach people with 4 different cards in a magic situation, they will almost never pick the card closest to them. Di Vernon, one of the biggest magicians in the 20th century, once said, no one picks the 9 of diamonds, ever. It's a big thing. You know, it's a lifelong career, and say no one never takes the 9 of diamonds. So I think it's a very interesting. So ریچارد, thank you so much for your time. It was an extreme pleasure. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. I had a lot of fun, as you can tell.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.